The wind chime my grandmother gave me was the first thing to break that morning. Brass tubes, the small kind hanging from the porch of the rental I'd lived in for 5 years with the man I'd promised forever. I heard it hit the concrete steps before I saw him standing in the driveway with 2 suitcases that weren't mine. "I packed your stuff already, Sadie." That was how he told me. No conversation, no sitting down at the kitchen table. Just my whole marriage zipped into luggage I didn't recognize because he'd bought them new from Target the day before. I found the receipt later crumpled in the trash. $89.99 for the set. That was what my husband thought I was worth in cargo. I'd been at the OBGYN that morning for the 3rd round of testing. 5 years of trying. 5 years of charts and ovulation strips and tears in the bathroom at family parties when my sister-in-law announced another pregnancy. The doctor had said the same thing every doctor had said. "Everything looks normal, ma'am. Sometimes these things just take time." But my husband had stopped believing that around year 3, around the time he started spending more weekends at the gym and less time looking me in the eye. "I'm not waiting anymore," he said, kicking my suitcase toward me like it was a dog he wanted off the porch. "I want kids, real ones, with someone whose body actually works." "I want to tell you," I screamed. "I want to tell you I threw something or slapped him or said the perfect sentence that ended him right there. I didn't." I stood on the porch in my work blouse and the slacks I'd ironed at 6 a.m. and watched a piece of brass roll into the flower bed, and I felt my whole chest go quiet, like someone had unplugged me from a wall. He told me he'd already been seeing someone. He told me she was pregnant. He told me the prenup his father's lawyer had drawn up, the one I'd signed at 26 because I trusted him and his family and I didn't know any better. Said I was entitled to $20,000 and no claim to marital property. He said he was being generous when he handed me a check for $4,000. He said if I tried to fight, his father would make my life expensive in ways I couldn't afford. "Take it and go," he said. "Don't make this ugly." I drove away from a house I'd painted myself, in a neighborhood I'd planted a garden in, and I cried so hard on the I-26 that I had to pull over twice. By the time I made it to the little rental cottage my cousin had found me in a small town outside Asheville, I had nothing left. Not money, not pride, not the will to unpack. I slept on a bare mattress that first night with my coat as a blanket because I couldn't make myself stand up long enough to find the sheets. The cottage was on a street with 6 houses, gravel driveways, oak trees, old enough to remember the Civil War. It was the kind of place where everyone left a porch light on. My neighbor on the right was a woman in her 70s who brought me a tomato pie the second day and patted my hand and didn't ask any questions. My neighbor on the left was a man with a black and tan German Shepherd and a beat-up Ford pickup, and a stillness about him that I noticed even through my own fog. I'd see him in the mornings walking the dog past my window before sunrise. He always wore the same kind of thing: gray work shirt, jeans that had seen seasons, a flannel when it was cold. He looked, I thought then, like a man who fixed things for cash and didn't know what else to do with his life. I felt sorry for him in the same vague, distracted way you feel sorry for anyone who lives alone. I didn't think about him much beyond that. I had my own ruin to manage. The wind chime stayed broken in the flower bed for 3 weeks. I couldn't bring myself to throw it away. My grandmother had given it to me the year before she died, and I'd carried it from apartment to apartment and finally to a house that wasn't mine anymore. The brass was bent and the cord had snapped and one of the tubes was missing entirely. It just sat there in the dirt, glinting whenever the sun moved. One Saturday in early October, I came home from a long shift at the bakery where I'd taken a job 2 weeks after my husband threw me out. I'd been a paralegal before, but no firm in a town this small was hiring, so I was on my feet from 5 in the morning shaping sourdough, and the wind chime was on my porch step. Cleaned. Rust-rung. A new tube where the missing one had been. Brass, the right size, the right tone. It was hanging from a small iron hook he must have screwed into my porch beam. There was a note. Pencil. Block letters. "Hope this is okay. Heard it ringing for years from your grandma's stories. Your neighbor." I stood there for a long time. I had not, of course, told him anything about my grandmother. I had not told him anything about anything. I had said hello twice and waved once. I sat down on the porch step and held the chime in my lap and cried until my mascara was on my collar. Looking back, I think that was the first time I understood I was being seen. not pitied, not managed, just seen. His name was a single syllable. He barely said the first time. Holt. That was it, like he didn't think the rest mattered. He came over the next afternoon when I knocked on his door to thank him, and he stood on his own porch with his thumbs in his belt loops and looked at the gravel like it was more interesting than my face. The shepherd sat at his heel and watched me with intelligent eyes. It wasn't anything, he said. It was everything. He shrugged. He had a small scar along his jaw and gray at his temples and a voice that sounded like he'd been quiet for a long time. He told me when I pressed that he'd done some metalwork in the service, that he was retired now, that he picked up small jobs for neighbors when they let him. He said it the way men say things they don't want to be asked about twice. I made him chicken and dumplings as a thank you that next Tuesday because my mother had raised me to never owe a kindness, and he sat at my second-hand kitchen table and ate 2 helpings and said it was the best thing he'd eaten since his own mother died 9 years ago. He helped me carry a bookshelf up from the curb where someone had left it. He showed up the morning the rental's furnace broke in November and was on his back in the crawl space before I could call the landlord. When I tried to pay him, he looked at the $20 bill like I'd handed him a piece of garbage and pushed it back across the table. Save it, he said. I want to be clear that none of it felt romantic at first. I was 31 years old and I had just been told my body was the reason my marriage ended. I had cried in so many bathrooms by then that I didn't know how to look at a man without flinching. Holt knew, somehow, without being told. He never stood too close. He never lingered in my doorway. He'd come, do what he'd come for. Drink a glass of water if I offered it and leave with the dog at his side. He left space around me the way you leave space around a wounded animal you don't want to scare. In December, my mother called. She lived 2 states over, in the small Georgia town I'd grown up in, and she had been the one stable thing in those months even though I'd kept the worst of it from her. I told her about my husband, but I'd kept it short. We separated, it's complicated, I'm fine. Because she was 67 and she'd buried my father the year before and I didn't want her to carry this too. Sadie Mae, she said on that December call. Honey, I need you to tell me the truth. I told her everything, the prenup, the $4,000, the girlfriend, the years of pretending. I cried through most of it and she just listened, and when I was done she said, "Get in your car this weekend, I want to see your face. And I want to meet whoever's been fixing your house, because I can hear in your voice that there's a someone." That was my mother. She heard everything you didn't say. I drove down that Saturday and stayed for 10 days, and when I came back, Holt had shoveled the inch of snow off my porch and stacked firewood by my back door. He'd cut it himself, he said, when I asked, from a tree that had come down on his property in October. He'd been seasoning it. That was the first night he came in and stayed. Not for that. Not the way the gossipy part of you wants to assume. He came in for coffee, and we sat by the fire he built in my little wood stove, and we talked for 4 hours. He told me he'd been married once. She'd died. A long time ago. He didn't say more about it, and I didn't ask. He told me he had a sister in Charleston and parents in Knoxville, and that he'd grown up on a farm. He told me the shepherd was named Bishop, after a man he'd served with. He told me he'd lived in this cottage for almost 12 years and had not, in those 12 years, had a single woman over for coffee. Why me then? I asked. He looked at me a long time. Because you said thank you for the wind chime. It was the kind of answer that didn't fully make sense and didn't need to. I understood it anyway. We weren't together that winter, not the way that word usually means. We were 2 people who had each lost something and had found a quiet that worked. He'd come over for dinner some Sundays. I'd help him in his garden when March came. Bishop took to sleeping on my porch in the afternoons like he'd decided I was his second house. I started feeling, for the first time in years, like my body wasn't a problem to be solved. It was just a body that lived in a town and baked bread and laughed sometimes. In April, I was 3 days late. I told myself it was stress. I told myself it was the new job and the new town and the divorce paperwork my husband's attorney had finally sent me, which I'd signed without reading too carefully because I was too tired to fight. I told myself 5 years of trying with my husband had taught me what my body could and couldn't do, and what my body couldn't do was this. I took the test on a Tuesday in the cottage bathroom. I sat on the edge of the tub and waited and didn't breathe. When I looked, I had to look 3 times. I called my mother before I called anyone else. I called Holt, second. He was at my door in under 10 minutes, and when I opened it, he just looked at me, and I started to cry. And I think he knew before I said anything because he came in and sat with me on the kitchen floor with his back against the cabinets and held my hand and didn't ask a single question for a long time. I don't know what to do, I finally said. You don't have to know yet. I'm 31 and I just got divorced and I'm working at a bakery and I live in a rental. And I'm scared. That's fair. And I'm happy. He squeezed my hand. That's fair too. The first OB appointment was at a small clinic in the next town over because my insurance was the cheap kind I'd had to pick up after my husband dropped me from his. The nurse was a sweet woman with red hair who took my blood pressure twice because the first reading was high. The doctor was a tired-looking man who slid the ultrasound wand across my belly and squinted at the screen and then sat back and looked at me with the particular kind of expression a doctor gets when they're about to change your life. "Ma'am," he said, "there are two." I made him say it again. He said it again. He turned the screen toward me and showed me, and I'm not going to pretend I understood what I was looking at, but he pointed to two small flickers and he said those were heartbeats, and I said, "Two." And he said, "Yes, ma'am, two." I told Holt in his kitchen that evening. He set down the dish he was drying. He said the only word he'd said in 20 years that didn't sound careful. "Both?" Then he sat down very slowly at his kitchen table and put his hands flat on it and looked at them like they belonged to a stranger. And then he stood up and walked across the kitchen and pulled me against his chest and held on. And I felt his heart going the way mine had gone. And we just stood there in his kitchen for a while. That was March turning into May. By June, my ex-husband had found out. I don't know exactly how. The town was small and his mother had a cousin somewhere in our county, and people talk, especially about a woman who left a man and turned up pregnant inside a year. He showed up at my cottage on a Saturday in his work car. The gray sedan he was so proud of, wearing the polo shirt he wore when he wanted to look like a serious person. I was on the porch shelling peas, 20 weeks along and already showing more than I'd expected because two will do that, and Bishop was at my feet and Holt was in his own yard rebuilding a fence post. My ex-husband got out of the car and stood at the bottom of my porch steps and looked at my belly like he was looking at a personal insult. "Whose is it?" I didn't answer. I kept shelling peas. My hands were shaking, but I kept going. "I asked you a question, Sadie. You don't get to ask me questions anymore. You told me you couldn't have kids. I told you the doctor said it would take time. You're the one who decided that meant something it didn't." He took a step up. Bishop stood up. He didn't growl. He didn't have to. My ex-husband stopped where he was. "Is that your dog?" "He's a friend's." "What friend?" That was when Holt came around the corner of his own yard, walking the way he walked when he was about to do something he'd thought about. He was wiping his hands on a rag. He didn't hurry. He didn't yell. "You all right, Sadie?" "Yes," I said. He was leaving. My ex-husband looked at Holt, took him in. The work shirt, the jeans, the gray at the temples. I watched my husband, my ex-husband, the man I had spent 5 years apologizing to, mentally categorize Holt as someone beneath him, and I watched something settle in his face that looked almost like relief. He smiled. It was the smile I had hated for years and hadn't realized I'd hated until that moment. "This is who you ended up with?" Holt didn't answer. "You really traded down, didn't you?" "You should leave," Holt said. "I'm having a conversation with my wife, ex-wife, and she said you were leaving." My ex-husband took another step up the porch. Bishop took a step forward. Holt did not move, but his weight shifted in a way I'd never noticed before. The kind of way a person who has been in places I hadn't been moves. My ex-husband stopped again. He looked at Holt one more time, made a noise in his throat, and walked back to his car. He left, but he came back. Not in person, not at first. In letters. His lawyer sent something claiming that the divorce had been fraudulent because I had withheld a pregnancy. I hadn't been pregnant when we divorced. I wasn't even pregnant for 3 months after. But his lawyer counted on me being too poor to fight. Then he started calling. Then his mother called. Then his sister called. He wanted to know about the babies. He wanted to know if I was sure they weren't his. He wanted, I realized later, to find some leverage to drag me back into his orbit, Because the new pregnancy with his girlfriend had ended badly in May, and he was looking for somebody to be in pain with him. I cried on Holt's couch one night in July when the letters got worse. He put a quilt around my shoulders and put a mug of decaf chamomile in my hands and sat across from me in the wing chair he'd had since before he met me. "You don't have to handle this alone," he said. "I can't afford a real lawyer." "You can." I looked at him. He set down his own mug. He pressed his hands together between his knees and stared at the floor for a while, and then he started talking, and that was the night I found out who Holt actually was. He hadn't been a metal worker in the service. He had been an officer. Special operations, the kind he didn't fully describe and I didn't fully ask about. After he'd left the service, he'd started a small security consulting firm with 2 men he'd served with. They were quiet about it because his line of work had always been quiet, and the work itself was the kind that paid more than I would have guessed. He hadn't lied to me. He had retired. He did fix things for neighbors. He had done metal work. But the rest of his life was bigger than the cottage he kept on a gravel road in a town nobody in his old world would think to look for him in. He had moved here after his wife had died because he could not stand being in their house anymore. He had stayed because he had liked the quiet. He had not told me because he had not wanted me to know him as anything other than the man who'd fixed my wind chime. "Why are you telling me now?" I asked. He looked at me for a long time. "Because you're carrying my children. And because that man is not going to let you alone. And because I'd rather you know who I am than find out in some way that scares you." I cried again. I had cried more in the years since my divorce than in the rest of my life combined, but these were different. He took the letters from me the next morning and made some phone calls in the kitchen while I sat in his yard with Bishop and tried to feel my babies move. My ex-husband stopped writing within 3 weeks. I don't know the specifics. Holt told me only that he had spoken with my ex's father and that the matter had been resolved, and that I would never again be threatened with a legal action I could not afford. I asked him once what he had said. He said, I told him the truth about who his son had married and the truth about what would happen if his son kept writing. I didn't press. I didn't want to know. What I did find out a few months later was that the property my ex-husband and I had lived in, the rental we'd been in for 5 years, which I had thought belonged to a management company, had been purchased in late summer by a small LLC. The new owner had declined to renew my ex-husband's lease. He had been given 30 days to vacate. The LLC was one of Holt's. I asked him about it once. He shrugged. It was a good investment. I named our daughter after my grandmother. I named our son after Holt's father because Holt had cried when I'd asked if I could. And I had never seen him cry until then. The pregnancy was hard at the end. I had pre-eclampsia for the last 6 weeks and was on bed rest, and Holt's old service friend, who happened to be one of the leading maternal fetal medicine specialists in the Southeast and had moved his practice closer to us when he heard, watched my numbers like he was watching a satellite. But they came out screaming and pink and perfect on a morning in early December, both of them, 23 minutes apart. My mother flew up the next day and held them both at the same time and cried into their blankets. She held Holt's face between her hands and said, "Thank you for my grandbabies." He didn't say anything. He just put his forehead against hers for a second. We got married in the spring in the cottage's backyard with my mother and his sister and the neighbor who'd brought the tomato pie and 4 of his old service friends. I wore a dress I'd bought at a consignment store for $80. He wore the only suit he owned. Bishop sat between us at the ceremony with a small bouquet tied to his collar and behaved better than half the humans there. We didn't move out of the cottage. We bought it, eventually, when the owner offered to sell. We added on. Holt built the addition himself, mostly, with one of his old friends helping on the heavy days. The wind chime hangs from the porch beam still. The babies are almost 2 now. The girl is fierce, the boy is quiet, like his father. They both love Bishop, who has gotten gray around his muzzle and tolerates them in the patient, dignified way. Old dogs tolerate small barbarians. I saw my ex-husband one time after all of it. I was at a gas station off the interstate 18 months after the twins were born, and he was at the next pump. He looked older. He looked smaller. He saw me, and he saw the car seats in the back, and he opened his mouth like he was going to say something, and then he closed it again. I think he had been planning for a long time what he would say to me if he ever saw me. I think he had forgotten that I didn't owe him a conversation. I got in my car. I drove home. Holt was on the porch when I pulled up. the babies down for their nap, a cup of coffee on the railing beside him. He looked up when I parked. He didn't ask where I'd been or who I'd seen. He just held out his hand for me to take when I came up the steps, and I took it. And we sat there for a while listening to the chime, which was rung that afternoon by a soft, almost accidental wind. My grandmother used to say the sound of brass was the sound of being remembered. I didn't understand it as a kid. I understand it now. The man my husband threw away was not a problem. She was just a woman in the wrong house, with the wrong man, in the wrong season of her life. The quiet neighbor with the dog didn't save me. He just opened his door when I knocked, and he kept opening it. And one day I realized I had been living inside the open door for a long time and that I was home. That's how the breaking turned out in the end. Gently. The way you finally let go of something you'd been holding too tight to notice was already gone. I think about that broken wind chime more than I should, not because of what it meant, but because of what it taught me. For 5 years I had been holding my marriage together with the same kind of tight, anxious grip my husband used on my self-worth. And the day that brass hit the concrete, something in me finally understood that holding tighter doesn't keep a thing from breaking. Sometimes the breaking is already done. You're just the last one to notice. My ex-husband decided I was the reason we had no children, and he built his whole story on that decision. He never let a doctor test him. He never sat in those waiting rooms with me. He made my body the problem because making himself the problem was a kind of math he wasn't willing to do. And what I have come to understand in the soft, tired evenings after the twins go down is that people who refuse to look at themselves will always need someone else to be the wound. I was his wound for 5 years. He needed me to be small so he could feel large. And the day I stopped being small, the only thing left for him to do was throw me out. Holt did not save me. I want to be careful about that, because I know how these stories get told. He opened a door, and he kept opening it, and he never once asked me to be smaller than I was so he could feel bigger. That is the whole difference. That is the whole thing. A man who has done real, quiet work on himself does not need a woman to shrink. He has room in him already. He doesn't have to make it by taking yours. What I learned, what I want my daughter to know when she's old enough to ask, is that strength is almost never loud. The men who told me I was nothing were always the loudest men in the room. The man who built the addition on our cottage with his own hands has never once raised his voice at me. There's a lesson in that I had to learn the hard way, but I'd rather have learned it late than not at all. And I learned this too. The body you have been taught to be ashamed of is not the body you actually have. For 5 years I believed something a man told me about myself that was not true, and it cost me 5 years. I will not believe a thing about myself again just because someone with a confident voice insists on it. I will look. I will check. I will wait for evidence. The wind chime still hangs on the porch. The brass has gone a little green at the edges. The twins are learning to walk under it, and on still mornings I can hear it from the kitchen. That soft brass sound my grandmother said was the sound of being remembered. I am remembered now, by the people who matter. And I remember myself. That is the part I almost lost, and that is the part I will not lose again.